Story 1.
The grave 274B Miguel had been digging graves for 23 years at the Cemetery of Peace, a silent refuge where life seemed suspended under the weight of eternity. He thought he knew every inch of that sacred ground, every ripple of earth, every shadow cast by the old headstones throughout the day, until one particular night. It was a damp Tuesday in September, the kind of day when the heavy, humid air promised a fine rain that never came, and the Mendez family's burial had been scheduled for plot 247B. Miguel arrived long before dawn, when darkness was still nearly absolute, broken only by the dim beam of his headlamp, to finish preparing the grave with the meticulous care of someone who respects the final resting. The morning fog hung thick, a damp veil between the weathered headstones, partly concealing the names and dates of lives long past. The only sounds breaking the sepulchral silence were the rhythmic, wet thud of his shovel biting into the cold, clinging earth, and the distant, intermittent rumble of the caretaker's truck, echoing as if from another world. Mrs. Elvira Mendez, 78, a matriarch known for her kindness and unshakable faith, had made it clear with the lucidity of someone who knows the end is near, that she wished to be buried beside Joaquim, her husband of 52 years. The family, heartbroken but determined to honor her last wish, paid a substantial extra fee for the specific location right next to Joaquim's grave where she could, in the words of her eldest grandson during the wake, finally rest with her beloved as she always deserved. But when Miguel, his back aching and his calloused hands caked in mud, glanced at his crumpled work order in the gray, pre-dawn light, something subtle yet crucial seemed wrong. The grave number, handwritten in ordinary blue ink, was faded by moisture and slightly smudged, as if a drop of dew or sweat had fallen on it. In the weak, foggy light of morning, through his exhaustion and haste, the number 247B could easily be mistaken for 274B. A tiny error, almost imperceptible, but one with consequences he could not yet imagine. A strange chill knot, entirely due to the fog, ran down his neck, but he brushed it off as fatigue. The funeral passed without apparent incident under a low, gray sky. With the solemnity earned over decades of service, Miguel lowered the polished wooden coffin into what he believed to be the correct grave, the groan of the straps echoing in the heavy silence. The family, dressed in black, wept openly, stifled sobs mingling with the priest's prayers. Fresh flowers, white lilies, and red roses were scattered over the coffin before the first shovel of earth covered the wood. A final farewell, and everyone left, mourning yet comforted, believing wholeheartedly that Elvira was now beside Joaquim in the eternal plane, just as she had wished. But that same night, as Miguel walked the narrow paths of the cemetery with his heavy lantern, locking the great wrought iron gates that creaked in protest, he heard something that made his blood freeze in his veins. A sharp, persistent sound, both metallic and organic, like long, desperate fingernails scratching old wood again and again. The sound was relentless, furious. It came with unsettling clarity from the exact direction of the recent burial. Quickly, Miguel told himself, forcing his breathing to slow, that it was just the natural settling of the earth, the creaks and shifts of a fresh grave under pressure. Or maybe a nocturnal animal, large rat or badger scraping near the surface. But when he returned the next morning, still early, with a pale sun struggling through the mist, he found something that defied all rational explanation, leaving him frozen at the grave's edge. The loose, dark soil had been visibly disturbed, not by animals. The scratches were deep, straight, far too precise for claws or paws. They formed a distinct, unsettling pattern on the surface, as if someone or something had been digging upward with unnatural determination. It looked like a message carved in lines of earth. Heart-pounding, Miguel ran to the small cemetery office and frantically checked the burial records. And then he saw it. Elvira was not in 247B. She was in 274B, 3 rows away. Those graves were in an isolated corner of the grounds, where dampness and neglect kept the soil perpetually dark and grass never took root. A place the older workers avoided mentioning. It was then that the old caretaker, Sir Antonio, approached and told him the grim story that had circulated among gravediggers for decades. In Ijolilsen, a man named Ribeiro had been buried in that very plot. A few weeks later, his body was removed in secret. His widow had discovered letters revealing a long affair with her best friend. The betrayal was so devastating that she paid to have the body removed and hidden in a distant, unmarked corner. Since then, 274B had remained empty and, according to whispers, not at peace. Terrified, Miguel returned to the grave that night, determined to take measurements and quietly request a transfer. But in the flickering light of his lantern, he saw that the scratches had deepened in. Now there were 2 distinct sets, one scratched upward, the other downward, as if 2 opposing forces were moving inside the same grave. The ground seemed to vibrate. Days later, the exhumation paperwork mysteriously vanished from the office. Sue Antonio retired and left town without a word. And Miguel kept hearing, night after night, the scratching and muffled voices coming from 274B, one high and pleading, the other low, heavy with anger. No flowers lasted more than a few days on that rectangle of earth. Until one morning, Miguel found a mud-stained note on his car windshield. Some mistakes can't be undone. Some neighbors can't be tolerated. Today, he only works the day shift hand, avoids looking in that direction. Because, deep down, he knows some mistakes can't be tolerated, and grave to 74B is proof of that. Not all rest in peace. Stay sharp, everyone. To all our amazing viewers and loyal subscribers, we know many of you watch our videos, but haven't subscribed yet. If you enjoy these stories and want to support this project, please hit subscribe, give the video a like, and share it. Now, enjoy what's coming up.
Story 2.
The Midnight Burial. Carlos had been working the night shift at the old city cemetery for 8 years. He knew every nocturnal sound, every creak of the old gates, every shadow cast by the ancient lampposts. He'd seen it, all mourners leaving flowers after hours, candles lit for secret rituals, teenagers. The solitude didn't bother him. He was the quiet guardian of a quiet place where time itself seemed to hold its breath. But on the night of October 13th, he saw something that simply wasn't on the books. October nights were always cold and damp. While the day crew handled the burials and groundskeeping, Carlos was in charge of the silent watch, patrolling the sectors, checking the cameras in the office, and securing the perimeter. The cemetery itself was old, built in the late 1800s over an even older burial ground, and it was unusual for a weathered headstone to shift and reveal a forgotten layer of history beneath. But what happened in the early hours of that morning defied everything he'd ever seen. At 2:47 a.m., patrolling the oldest section block 3, he caught sight of a flickering light at the far end of the cemetery, where the old lamps never worked. 4 yellow points of flame, like tiny beacons, moved slowly among the gravestones. Thinking it was just some kids with candles or a secretive ceremony, Carlos approached, his footsteps muffled by the damp grass. But as he got closer, he realized this was different. He stopped dead in his tracks. There were 6 figures dressed in outdated morning clothes, tailcoats, and high-collared black dresses gathered around an open grave. Each one held a single candle, but the flames seemed to give off no heat. Even from a distance, Carlos could see his own breath misting in the freezing air. Using thick ropes, they were slowly lowering a simple, unadorned wooden coffin. There was no conversation, no crying, no prayer. Only the dry creaking of the ropes and the soft, muffled thud of earth hitting wood. Carlos tried to call out, to ask what they were doing, but his voice caught in his throat. He was an eyewitness to something that felt not just strange, but fundamentally wrong. He looked around. The granite tombstones nearby were dated 1890, but they looked new, as if freshly carved. The mourners themselves seemed to flicker in and out of focus, their shapes almost too sharp, like images projected onto the night air. He instinctively reached for his radio, but there was no sound, not even static. His lantern, usually a reliable beacon, began to fail, its beam weakening until it was a faint, useless glow. The funeral party finished their work in absolute silence, filling the grave with dirt that seemed to appear from nowhere. After tamping it down, each figure placed a single white lily on the newly packed soil. Then, instead of walking away together, they turned and walked toward different tombs. Carlos stood, frozen in place, as he watched them disappear one by one, slowly sinking into the ground as if the earth were reclaiming them. When the sun finally rose, Carlos, his mind reeling, called the day manager and led him to the spot. But there was no grave, no fresh dirt, no flowers, nothing but old gravestones and undisturbed grass. Back in the administrative office, they consulted the leather-bound registry. Carlos's shaking finger found the entry for October 13th, 1897. It noted that 7 members of the Morera family had been buried there after a fire. The ceremony, the note specified, had occurred from midnight to dawn. The final entry on the page, written in a different hand, said that only 6 bodies had been recovered. The 7th, the youngest son, had vanished in the flames. Carlos still works at the old city cemetery, but every year on October 13th, he refuses to do the night rounds in Block 3. He learned a hard lesson that night. Not all rest in peace.
Story 3.
The grave that weeps. David had been the head caretaker of Greenmount Cemetery for 15 years. He had experienced many things in that place until something unusual happened with one particular grave. Greenmount Cemetery sat on a gentle hillside overlooking the valley, its well-tended grounds holding 3 generations of the town's families. David took pride in caring for the sacred space, keeping the grass trimmed, the headstones clean, and the paths clear for grieving visitors. Every morning, he walked the entire property, checking for damage, vandalism, or anything out of place. For 15 years, that routine had been as predictable as the sun risen till the morning. He heard sobbing coming from gravesite 156A. At first, David assumed it was an early visitor paying respects, but as he drew closer, he realized no one was there. The crying came from beneath the headstone, muffled, heartbroken wail that seemed to rise directly from the earth below. The grave belonged to Sarah Michelle Silva, age 7, who had died of pneumonia in 1952. Beloved daughter, forever in our hearts. Read the inscription. David had cared for that plot for years without incident, but now each morning brought the same sound, a quiet sobbing that began precisely at 6:15 a.m. and continued until sunset The lament was gut-wrenching, the sound of a child in inconsolable pain. David checked with other staff members, but no one else heard anything unusual. Visitors to nearby graves showed no sign of noticing the crying. It seemed only David could hear the tears of little Sarah. He searched the burial records, hoping for some explanation. Sarah had been laid to rest in a small, white coffin, surrounded by her favorite toys and wearing the dress she had planned to wear on her 8th birthday. 3 weeks after the phenomenon began, David noticed something disturbing about Sarah's grave. The ground around the headstone was always damp even during the driest days. Not just damp, but truly wet, as though water was welling up from below. He tested the soil and found no broken pipes or irrigation issues. The moisture had a strange quality, was slightly warm, and when he tasted it, it was salty, like tears. David began staying later, trying to understand what was happening to Sarah's resting place. One night, when the crying grew especially intense, he knelt beside the headstone and pressed his ear to the ground. What he heard made him stumble back in shock. Beneath the sobbing, there was another voice, woman's, whispering, "Forgive me, my daughter. Mommy's coming. Mommy's coming to take you home." That night, David researched the Silva family history. Sarah's mother, Marguerite Silva, had died in a car accident just 2 weeks after Sarah's burial in 1952. But Marguerite had not been buried in Greenmount Cemetery. She had been laid to rest across town at Carvalho Memorial. David discovered that Marguerite had blamed herself for Sarah's death. She had been working double shifts at the textile factory to pay the bills and had not noticed Sarah's symptoms until the pneumonia was too advanced for treatment. The accident report revealed Marguerite had been driving toward Greenmount Cemetery when she crashed. Police found a small suitcase in the car containing children's clothes, toys, and a letter expressing her intention to join Sarah where she belongs. For 71 years, Marguerite Silva had been trying to complete that final journey. David arranged for Margaret's remains to be transferred to Greenmount Cemetery, to be buried in the plot adjacent to Sarah's. The process took 6 months of paperwork and bureaucratic approval. On the day of Margaret's exhumation, David arrived early to prepare the site. As the coffin was lowered into the ground beside Sarah's grave, something extraordinary happened. For the first time in months, the crying stopped. In its place, David heard something that brought tears to his own eyes, the gentle, loving voice of a woman singing a lullaby. The grass around both graves grew thick and green after that day. Visitors often comment on how peaceful that section of the cemetery feels, and children playing nearby are sometimes heard laughing, as if someone unseen were playing with them. Some separations, David learned, are too painful for death to keep. If you work with the dead or have witnessed something unexplainable in a cemetery? Share your story in the comments. The boundary between life and death is not as solid as we like to believe, and not all rest in peace.